Oh, it's nice to be sociable. Why don't we all say good morning to each other?
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, class.
How do you say it in Italian?
Huh?
How do you say good morning in Italian?
Well, buongiorno. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Oh, grazie. This illegible stuff is a development of stuff in the notes for today, which, if you would take one, Anna, and pass it down, thank you. So, good morning, Adara. Buongiorno, Adara. Come sta? How are you? So if you're looking at the notes for today, so it would be useful to have the notes from Wednesday, and also Il Principe, although, yeah, actually we are going to read from this today, and the Musa stuff that I want to do. We didn't really get to that on Wednesday. Unless you think I'm falling behind my schedule, which is not exactly beyond the realm of possibility. Today is not Wednesday. I forgot to change the date when I brought some of the stuff over from Wednesday. No sono perfetto. I'm not perfect. How are you today, Anna?
Very tired.
Yeah, you're a little quiet. Sort of like you're a two-legged black hole right there, and I can see Hannah kind of being drawn over into your sphere.
Nobody is drawn to me, let's be clear on that. Yeah.
You might want to move a couple of seats down. She sounds dangerous. So, today what I want to do is introduce, is to set up a mud wrestling match between Musa and Mansfield on how to translate, and for that matter, interpret Machiavelli. In response to a question you asked Sierra a couple of days ago, I went on, and of course lost track of myself and changed the subject. Mars in Sagittarius, square Mercury in Virgo. I suggested that scholarship, and ever since Machiavelli published the prints in 1513, first in handwritten manuscript, but then very quickly it was printed up, and Mansfield says, by the way, in his introduction, you may be holding in your hands, or you're holding in your hands probably the most famous book on politics ever written. And he says, short of the Republic, but you've had Ancient, right? The Republic is a long and complicated book. And the Prince is pretty short, but as you're going to see, it's short and complicated. But what I hope to do is to unlock some of the complication by looking at its overall structure and looking at how the Prince unfolds after we create the mud. Oh, so the three great ways of interpreting Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a Machiavellian. Musa says right at the beginning of his introduction, if you've read it, Machiavelli was no Machiavellian. What an interesting thing to say. And as I told you, when I was a TA for political theory at UVA with a class of 800 people and my professor, Dante Geronimo, so the three primary interpretations is Machiavelli was a Machiavellian. That's Mansfield, by the way, and it's also Polvordi. Not that Polvordi's so profound and original. I only do what the grown-ups tell me to do. Although don't ask Dr. Dunn about that one. But I'm basically in Mansfield's camp for reasons I'll try to explain. Musa, as we'll see, considers Machiavelli primarily a Renaissance humanist. Now, what that means is, and don't forget, I mean, smart people can disagree about these profound things. Smart people disagree with each other all the time. And so what does it mean to be a Renaissance humanist? Well, Machiavelli lived in the 1500s during the high Italian Renaissance. And you understand, by the way, our terms like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, those were not used by the people who lived in those time and places. Renaissance, the term Renaissance in the periodization of Western history as ancient, medieval, and Renaissance modern, I think that goes back to Jacob Burckhardt, a German historian in the 1800s, who first called the period of the Renaissance. Now that doesn't mean something wasn't going on and people were changing the way they looked at things and everything. But let's be clear. Let's distinguish that from the Reformation. They both begin with R. I'm letting that sink in. The difference is the people who were in the Reformation called what they were doing the Reformation. Does that make sense? I mean, Luther and Calvin, very quickly, another term for the civil war that unfolded in Christianity at that time was not only the Reformation, and which led, by the way, and this is important for our semester. You know what the 30 Years' War was? You nodded.
I nodded because I vaguely remember talking about it in classes with Dr. Brown.
All right, well, here's a little context. And the other term I would introduce is Protestantism. Now, Luther and Calvin didn't call themselves Protestants, but the German princes who fell in behind them and supported them, primarily for political and strategic reasons, that's when the term Protestant, so Catholic versus Protestant. The 30 Years' War was literally the civil war in Christian Europe that unfolded as a result of the war between Protestantism and Catholicism. Why is that important? Descartes is going to mention that. When he mentions that he was sitting in, that he came up, you're going to see Descartes says, I came up with this little book on how to, the full title of the Discourse, which is the next major work we're turning to after we watch our movie, is the Discourse on the method of right reasoning and conducting oneself in the sciences. I tried to mangle that a little, but we just call it the Discourse on Method. And he says, I wrote this little work while, during the winter, during the wars, sitting next to my little stove. Actually, that's a big element in Descartes' commentary, that he wrote this sitting next to a little stove. But the context is, there are two critical pieces of context that Descartes tells you about what he's writing. One, he lets you know that it's during the great religious wars of Europe. Now, by the way, this was right on the heels of the 100 Years' War. Europe has been a mess ever since the Roman Empire dissolved. It almost seems, and of course this isn't just Rome, and hold this in mind, isn't it true that not only have politics been pretty shitty during most of humanity's 5,000, 7,000 year history, what seems to be our favorite activity?
Fighting.
Yeah, killing each other in war. And you're going to see these great authors are fully aware of that, and the new humanity, if you're writing this down in terms of my endless rambling, you're going to see one of the most profound and developed visions of what the future of humanity will look like as a result of these great philosophers and their work. Part 6 of the Discourse on Method. I'll just tell you where this goes. Descartes looks back, after he tells humanity how to do science. He envisions a vast, united human species engaged in the common activity of science. That is to say, how many of you think you can know all the truth there is to know in one lifetime? I mean, if you ask certain people in this department. But Descartes says, I'm a brilliant guy and I'm teaching humanity how to do its work, but I'm going to die soon too. And he did die, by the way. He died a couple of years after he wrote that. Actually, he died 2 decades. He died of pneumonia in Denmark, Sweden. The princess of Sweden asked him to come and tutor him, and he was born in French, where all they do is eat butter, wine, and snails, and roll around in the sun and go to the Riviera in the summer. And so he agreed, and he went up there and immediately caught pneumonia and died in 1651. But he said this vision, and it's a vision. Once humanity learns how to do science, scientific experiment, and you've all had science classes, right? You've all been taught the scientific method, right? Okay, this is the guy that formulated it with Francis Bacon, by the way. But here's his vision. Once humanity learns how to do science, the whole species will be involved in learning about and conquering nature. It's not I will become God, it's we will become God. Because isn't nature complex? And even if you lived 300 years, you wouldn't be able to do all the experiments necessary to unlock the secrets of nature. That's why Descartes turns to humanity. And as you're going to see, what's the main obstacle of humanity getting together and turning itself into the scientific species? What we just mentioned. What have we been doing for 7,000 years? Yeah, fighting. And both Descartes and especially Hobbes will say, who's responsible for this? Princes and priests. What does that mean?
Religion and politics.
If humanity isn't driven into fruitlessly warring camps by virtue of their princes who want glory and conquest, and by the way, you're going to see there's a reason why Machiavelli wrote this book exactly for those people. Machiavelli too wants to change human condition, but he knows, don't go for the priests. If you do, they'll burn you. But princes, what do princes want? Power. And so Machiavelli was clever and brilliant. He wrote a little book on politics, out of which will come the profound changes that unfold in the thinkers we're subsequently reading. But Hobbes lets you know that if you're going to overcome the endless wars of humanity, if you're going to teach humanity to rise above their warring little petty camps, and if the princes aren't getting us all to kill each other, then we do it on our own because of our different religious beliefs. And there's some proof for that, isn't it? I mean, look at the historical period these guys lived in. Descartes lived during the 30 Years' War, the great humanity, Christian Europe. And by the way, how many of you are Christians? You know what the body of Christ is?
Yeah.
Right, the Soma Christi, the Corpus Christi. It's Christ embodied on earth. And you would think, okay, given what Jesus stood for, wouldn't the collective embodiment of Christianity be a place of peace and tolerance and unity and love for all humanity? You could say, when Christians succeed in being the embodiment of Christ, that's exactly what they turn out to be. But would you say the collective embodiment of Christ in Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Protestantism, what does it seem to, if they're not killing each other, what are they doing? They're busy burning people within their own, Sierra.
Did you see that guy that was like saying there was witches in his church? That guy, I don't know, he's in the evangelical, he was like, there are 6 witches in this church and 3 of them are in this congregation right now. And if you guys don't leave, I'm going to out you guys. He said a demon told him.
Down here in South Carolina?
No, I don't know where this is. I think Texas.
And then he said, and moreover, no pay raises for you 6 witches this year.
And he said 2 of them, okay, there's a speculation that some of these women might have just been talking crap about him because 2 of them are in his wife's.
You sure it was witches and not something else?
He said witches.
Okay. No. But look at the advantages. They could do all their office copying without copying machines. All they need is wands. Copio. All right. Interesting. But you understand, the big story behind all of these philosophers is, as we've already seen, and as we saw in Mandragora, get humanity up off its knees, get them busy actually changing the world we live in, and what will eventually happen is, instead of a species of petty and self-destructive warring little camps led by ambitious princes and superstitious priests, we can have Star Trek. No, I'm serious. You guys, we can have a united world of peace and plenty. That's the vision behind all of these works, and you'll see it unfold. So to go back to the context that I did kind of get off.
Killing each other and start killing aliens instead.
Or they're going to get us.
Yeah.
So would you say that these philosophers were very optimistic?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's why I call this great alternative comic political hedonism. Remember, and this is why every time I teach Mandragora, I'm confirmed in my decision to use it because I can save time by just going to the print. But you really get Machiavelli in Mandragora. And I know I've repeated it a million times. It's not trivial that he takes this ancient, broken story and by the addition of the catalyst ligurio, changes all the elements into a common. That's what I think Machiavelli is laying out for humanity in chapter 25 of The Prince, as you'll see. And what Descartes and Hobbes and Locke and all the others, up through Marx and Nietzsche, they all promise a new world, a new humanity. But, and you'll see when we turn to Descartes, it's a new house for humanity, right? And how many of you would love to live in a new house? I mean, a nice new house. But, okay, what if you're going to build it where you're living? What's the problem?
Where do you live
There's
in
a
between?
college there.
Yeah, and you're going to see Descartes actually uses this metaphor. He says, you don't destroy your old house while you're still living in it. And the delicate task of how do you live in the old world while you set in motion the forces that eradicate it and transform it and replace it with something else and not get burned in the process. You're going to see that's an issue. You should know, how many of you are Catholics? Do you know the Catholic Church has and still does maintain the index of prohibited works? The works that a good Catholic is not supposed to because they're doctrinally destructive or pernicious and forbidden. The instant that Machiavelli published The Prince, it was slapped on the index of prohibited works. The moment that Descartes published his, Hobbes had to flee for his life because of the charge of atheism from the Church of England. So it's the delicate situation of producing the new world while you're living in the old one, as you're going to see, is a strategic thing. Okay, so I want to go back to some of the really big points. That was the rhetorical term I introduced. I used to like to say the RBPs, the really big points, or the RBQs, the really big questions from the Monongahela. Okay, so I want to introduce the structure of The Prince and talk about some interesting things unleashed by its structure and design. And then you're going to see you really can divide The Prince. It depends on how you do this. I think the core organization of The Prince is centered, and this is not original to me. This is Mansfield and 1,000 other more brilliant political philosophers. Chapter 15. Everybody, Musa, Mansfield, everybody who reads The Prince, Dante Germino, they all think that chapter 15 is the fulcrum of the book. And it's as to use a phrase that a professor of Mansfield's, and who's the founder of the School of Political Philosophy that I was raised in, Leo Strauss, who wrote a great book on Machiavelli called Thoughts on Machiavelli, or Sub-Machiavelli. He calls chapter 15 the clarion call of modernity. But everyone agrees. All sensitive and perceptive readers of Machiavelli understand that it's chapter 15 where Machiavelli is laying out his cards. In one of the shortest chapters, there are two very short chapters in The Prince. Chapter 1, as we'll see, and chapter 15. So you could say chapter 15 divides The Prince into two works, two halves. From 1 to 14 roughly is what you could call the practical, where Machiavelli lays out much of his practical political teaching. And then, I guess I'm going down and coming back, so don't expect any orderly presentations here. And then chapter 15, it depends. I consider chapter 15 part of the theoretical, as you're going to see. But you could say if it's the fulcrum, the turning point of the book, then his theoretical teaching for humanity is laid out in the rest. Although that division itself is not dispositive, because as you're going to see, there's some important theoretical teachings in the first half, and there's some important practical teachings in the latter half. In fact, chapter 26, I'm sorry, that's right, 2 plus 6, 26. Chapter 26 is actually, what is it? It's an invitation to rise up and free Italy. It's a practical urge. And you're going to see there is theory in the first half, and practical teaching in the second half. But the real organizing principle is as you're going to see in chapter 1, when he's laying out, chapter 1 I'm going to try to walk through, and that's what I've done. I've drawn a structure of chapter 1 for you. It's really chapter 1 as the table of contents of the book. Because, by the way, the table of contents that Musa uses and that Mansfield uses, Machiavelli did publish The Prince with a table of contents. That's true. And here's an interesting thing. which should key into your awareness of what he's doing. The Prince is the first great work in political philosophy written in the vernacular. I mean, in ancient Greece, of course, Plato and Aristotle wrote in Greek, and Cicero wrote in Latin. But with the rise of the Middle Ages and the dominance of the church, Latin became the international language of commerce, but also the liturgical language of the church, and all scholars wrote in Latin. But you're going to see the next two works, the Prince and the Discourses, were the first great works of political philosophy written in the vernacular. Machiavelli used his muscular Italian, and you can see from the Mondragole, it's pretty muscular. Not just because he puts vulgar words in the mouth of Messer Nietzsche, but you can tell. I don't know whom you would say is the most refined and thoughtful character in the Mondragole. Would you take a stab at that?
Hmm?
If you had to look at all the characters, who's the stupidest and most vulgar?
Mr. Nietzsche.
And whom would you say is probably the most reflective and high-toned? Actually, I'm not sure how to answer this myself. I only thought of this question sometimes. I think you could argue
I
Lucrezia.
think it's Cyril.
Yeah,
He has
Cyril.
no lines.
You're right.
He's a man of few words. He chooses them carefully. All he ever says is yes, no, sure.
I'll do it. Up yours. I think you could say perhaps Lucretio, but isn't it clear that with respect to expression, self-consciousness, and self-awareness, Frate Timoteo is pretty, I mean, after all, he's a learned man. Most priests were, really, when you think about it. I think Ligurio is. And wouldn't you say that of all the characters, the ones who know human beings the best is Ligurio? In fact, it's out of his knowledge of how human beings behave that he becomes the key to the play. Machiavelli, I think, will claim the same thing. So if I haven't hit you over the head with this obvious point, I think Machiavelli is Ligurio, and Ligurio is Machiavelli. And what Ligurio is doing for the unhappy characters in the Mondragole, showing them how to get what they want, and in the process, by the way, tricking some of them into getting what they want. Because aren't they, again, as I made this point, the first of the 6 points I made, this play has a happy ending, right? Everyone gets what they want. The only difference between the characters at the beginning of the play is they're unhappy and unfulfilled because they haven't got the object of their passions. The only difference at the end is they still are who they are and they're defined by their self-interest. It's just that they got what they wanted. But didn't some of them have to be fooled into? In fact, who's the only character who doesn't know what's going on by the end of the play?
Mr. Nietzsche.
Yeah, he's the only one, but he's happy. And that's why I think the second point I made was, it's better to be tricked than it's better to trick than to be tricked. But how many of you agree, if it was a question you're being happy or not, wouldn't you want to be manipulated into your own happiness?
No.
Yes. To be naive is good, like not good, but it's happiness.
You'd rather be happy than intelligent.
No, but like if something that bad was happening, ignorance is bliss, right? So he's happy because he has no idea what's going on. He could be miserable and out of a life and know how miserable he should be, but instead he just has no idea and thinks he's going to get a job.
Yeah,
And that's better for him.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, isn't it true that this funny thing and this whole complicated plot could easily have turned into a horrible tragedy if at any point in time he understood what was going on? Yeah, Natalie.
I think it more so depends on the situation for me, because I think it's like you're happy, but it's like lying happiness instead of like truthful, honest happiness in a sense.
So who would prefer truth over happiness? You'd rather be happy, unhappy and knowledgeable than happy and naive?
I think that you can sort of create your own happiness even in a bad situation. So I would rather know that something bad is going on and then have to figure out how to be happy despite it.
Anybody else?
I think it's like a sense of control,
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, because it's kind of like they have that control over me, over my happiness, and it's kind of like, oh, if only like they knew, then it would just ruin everything. Then it's like I know, then yeah.
Anna, and then Hannah and Tabitha.
I don't think that happiness that's based on a lie is ever going to be real happiness. I think it's just feeding more into the lie that you have to tell yourself.
So you have a kind of faith in the world that over time truth will out.
Eventually, yes. Maybe not, it won't have great consequences, but at least.
It's certainly true of marriage. Hannah.
Well, and that, on consequences, that was my thought, is like, even if you are happy in your ignorance, like, you still can face that, consequences of that ignorance. So,
Say it again.
even if you are happy in your ignorance, you can still face the consequences of ignorance.
So, like Natalie just said, I think, or Tabitha, it's an issue of power over yourself. And even if you're tricked into being happy, you'd rather have the ability to control your own life through awareness. And then if you did fall into unhappiness, at least you'd have the tools to work your way out of it. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, I just want to, so it's like, I think it's like relative. Because obviously we don't want to be tricked because we're not ignorant. But I said, y'all want to be tricked? I said, oh, y'all, wait, what? What are y'all disagreeing with?
Well, here, can I be very blunt and very schematic? I think Machiavelli is Ligurio, and I think humanity, actually, who's the human race? It's a combination of Messer Nietzsche, Callimaco, who's the prince, and Lucrezia. When I asked, the last question I asked on Wednesday, because I didn't put it down, is how many, you all thought that Lucrezia was a victim, either of her own beliefs, her own virtue, her society, the men in her life, or whatever, or the rapist who initiates her self-destruction. But I said, how many of you think Lucrezia is a victim? And you shook your head vigorously.
Did I?
Yeah? She said she's not a victim. And again, this was one of the, if I had written, and I have in previous iterations of the course, given a little paragraph reading to someone and say, to parallel the one about Lucrezia, how many of you think Lucrezia is a victim?
I don't know what I was gonna say. Well, I think that she's still a victim in the fact that, like, even if she had chosen, like, she didn't actually have a choice in the matter of, like, being with Callimaco. Like, she could have said no, but regardless, like, his intention was to rape her if she was to say no.
Well, by the way, you could say that what Ligurio persuades Callimaco is not to rape her, but to, and here we'll get to the difference between acquiring and maintaining. Because the tragedy of Sextus Tarquinius is he got what he wanted. He acquired her, but then he lost everything. What's the happy ending, the happy ending version? Not only does Callimaco get Lucrezia for one night, but Messer Nietzsche says, here's the key to my house. You come and have dinner with us whenever you want. Stay overnight as frequently as you want. So, by the way, as you're going to see, that's the organizing theme of the Prince. Princes want power, right? And you're going to see some kinds of political order are easy to conquer, but hard to hold on to. How many of you would rather be able to maintain or hold on to what you got? Doesn't that kind of make the point of getting reasonable? Unless, like Callimaco, isn't he so moved by his passion, he's ready to destroy himself and just to have that one taste of pleasure. Well, Ligurio shows him how to get it and hold on to it. Sierra?
Oh, I wasn't raising my hand.
Remember, it's like an auction if you make a random motion. Alright, so, you didn't think Lucrezia was a victim?
I don't have an opinion, so I don't know if I
Oh.
shook my head, I don't know why. Because I don't know.
Well, I saw you going like this.
Maybe I was
Maybe it was
like
my
talking to
imagination.
myself or something.
How can we define victim again?
Being controlled by forces around you and being literally, remember, victor, both words victor and victim come from the same root in Latin. The victor is the one who wins, and the victim is the one who conquers or gets screwed.
Well, if you think about it as well, she's a victim of religion because she thinks, like, if she genuinely believed that it was divine intervention for realize she had to sleep with Callimaco. She's a victim of that because that made the choice for her.
Except towards, I think it's in Act 4, there's a
Not
turning.
you said what she said.
Well, and by the way, doesn't she start resembling Lucrezia? Why is Lucrezia childless? First of all, she's married to an impotent dope. But she is a victim of her own piety. And they do use her piety against her, right? That's where Frate Timoteo. But what's the turning point in play? I think this is why the answer is she starts out as a victim, but she doesn't. She ends up fully in control. What's the turning point? What does Callimaco do when he is with her?
He told her everything.
He told her everything. And then she says, well, if that's the case, given the wickedness of my confessors, the stupidity of my husband, and everything. And then, isn't she the key to the happy ending of the play after that? She is fully aware. If you want to talk about happiness versus awareness, she's both happy and aware. Now, on this question of how do you live in the world while you're transforming it, what's the last scene of the play take place in?
Church.
Remember, Machiavelli doesn't tear down the church. He doesn't destroy the church. But is the church the same institution at the end that it is, so to speak, at the beginning? It's been corrupted. It's been transformed. The form has been preserved, but not the content. Yeah, I didn't want to pick on.
I said, you don't necessarily have to demolish something in order to destroy it.
Rather, you have to subtly transform it while
Into
the
the
people.
antithesis of what it was intended to be.
Now, this goes back to the Prince and the question of translation, which we'll finally get to. So note that the table of contents that both Musa and Mansfield employ is Machiavelli's table of contents. But here's an interesting thing. It goes back to what I said about these being the first works, political works in the vernacular. All of Machiavelli's title chapters are in Latin, and the content of all the chapters is in Italian, modern Italian. Ancient titles, modern content. Doesn't that suggest something? And what does it suggest? It has to do with the preservation of the word virtue. I think, in other words, that's a confirmation of Machiavelli's larger intentions. What looks like an ancient teaching. And by the way, do you remember in the play, who's the character that's so stupid that he gets impressed whenever he hears Latin?
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, remember? He immediately signs on for Callimaco as a doctor, just hearing him talk about women's urine in Latin. That's how I got this job. Actually, with barking and taking my thumb off. So on one level, the idea that you preserve at least the outward form of the old while you transform its content to make way for a new reality, I think that hovers through all of these works, by the way. So I think in the next 15 minutes, I won't be able to finish what I wanted to finish. So, but I have actually sort of thought through the next couple of sessions. So let's presume that I at least get 1/3 of the way through what I want to talk about today. On Monday, we'll turn to the first half of the Prince, 1 through 14, and kind of pick that apart. And Wednesday, we'll turn to the second half, and we'll kind of get through the end of the book. Next Friday, we'll try to do some summary conclusions about what Machiavelli's project is, etc. And then from Monday through the 28th through March the 4th, we'll spend those 3 sessions watching Crimes and Misdemeanors. Any questions? All right, good. Notice I didn't wait for the answer. So, do you have notes from Wednesday? I don't want to go over the 6 really big points from Dragala, but I do want to link these points. The first point of being comedy, we've hammered that to death. But the new definition of who you are as your self-interest, and your interest is your passion. This is, I think, as you're going to see, this is pretty well laid out in chapter 15. So, as you're going to see, Machiavelli, and what is chapter 15 and why does everyone point to it as the fulcrum? Because in chapter 15, he says, I am doing something new that's never been done before. So if somebody says, I'm doing something new, follow their language. What's the new thing he's doing? You've all heard, he says, about politics based on kingdoms and principalities that never existed. And you might know Isaiah chapter 7 as reflected in Handel's Messiah. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, unto us a child is born, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Almighty God, the Everlasting Father. And what comes last? The Prince of Peace. What's another name for Jesus on his resume?
On his resume? That one. Why would you say that?
9 pages of stupid things. Well, I mean, among other
Job
things.
description?
Huh?
I said that's your job description?
Prince of Peace.
No, say stupid things.
Oh,
Yours.
no. Yeah. Yes, I came into this world saying stupid things, and I'm going to exit this world saying stupid things. I think I told you I'm already working on my own eulogy.
Don't.
Why would you say
Let's
that?
not today.
Okay, no,
Not
I've
today.
done something like that.
Yeah.
Mine starts out like this. Friends, family, everybody, I know for 70 years all of you have been asking the critical question, what will it take to shut that guy up?
70 years. Do you have a plan of when?
Well, I'm planning not to die when I retire, but
That's
done
a
with stuff for
requirement
20
upon
years that I was going
retiring
to get
from
killed in
Congress.
95 community.
Die.
Oh.
All right, so, all right.
We were on Jesus.
Jesus, that's right.
Prince of Peace.
The Prince of Peace. How many have read the New Testament? And what does Revelations initiate? The kingdom of God. In fact, you know the Hallelujah chorus, which is taken from Revelations. The kingdom of our Lord, the kingdom has become, the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. And of his Christ. So, when Machiavelli says, many have dreamed or imagined principalities, I think and kingdoms. I think when he's talking about principalities, kingdoms, I think he's speaking about the biblical kingdom of God. And when he says republics that have been imaginary, he's talking about Plato's Republic. In other words, I think in one sentence, Machiavelli is telling you that he's rejecting the whole of antiquity. And what was the main defect of the whole of antiquity? It taught humanity how to live in this world based on imaginary things rather than real things. And he says, I'm going to talk about politics and human beings, not the way they should behave, but rather the way they do behave. Many political scientists and political philosophers say Machiavelli is the first real political empiricist. What's an empiricist? Well, modern science is modern science because it's empirical. What does that mean?
Based on observation.
Yeah. And so you could say, whereas Machiavelli says the Bible and Greek political philosophy, Aristotle and Plato, base human life on the way people should behave, or on a reality that either may or may not exist, either a god or a soul. I'm going to teach you how to do human life based on the way people really behave. He's an empiricist. And do you remember, to go back, and then we'll go back to Musa and Mansfield and at least do that today. I suggested that there were 3 ways of interpreting Machiavelli. A Machiavellian, a Renaissance humanist, that's Musa, and Dante Germino, who argued that what Machiavelli was really doing was actually saving Christianity. How? Because Machiavelli says in chapter 15, if you're a priest, if you're a prince who tries to do everything that Jesus did, how are you going to end up in this world?
You're always going to fall short because there's nobody that can do that.
Well, and if you're trying to hold on to a kingdom or a principality using Christian morality, what's going to happen to you?
You'll probably get taken over because
Yep.
other people aren't, and they're going to be.
You're going to lose it in this world. Now, by the way, let's be clear. Let's say to Machiavelli right off, are you saying that Jesus was naive because he ended up crucified?
Didn't he know what was going to happen the whole time?
Right, of course. So, but on one level, you could say, okay, the only reason Jesus got crucified is because he didn't understand how wicked human beings could be. Of course, that's not true. Jesus was utterly aware of that. That's why from the crucifix, what's his last words? Actually, his last words in John and I think Matthew are, my God, why have you forsaken me? But he does say as they're crucifying him, forgive them, for they know what they did. So he's aware of what's happening to himself, right? It isn't naivete that explains Jesus' behavior. But I think Machiavelli would say, any prince that tries to be a prince in this world following that. And by the way, do you remember we talked about this? You could say the essence of Christian morality is the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Another way of saying that in Matthew 5 and 6 is, Jesus says, you've heard, love your neighbors yourself, but I tell you today what? What's the radicalization of that?
Your enemy is.
Yeah. If you were a prince who was ruling a kingdom and your motto was love your enemy as yourself, how long do you think you're going to be a prince in this world? Not very long. And then, so Machiavelli is going to have, and this is where you're going to see where the second half of the book comes in. And let me jump ahead and then jump back to what I wanted to really do. I think the structure of the second half of the book, the theoretical half, is I actually think Machiavelli introduces his new political philosophy in three great peaks or waves. And I call that chapter 15 is the new politics, and that's what we're talking about. The new politics and morality. If you're going to be a good prince, a successful prince, you have to learn how to be both good and bad. So Machiavelli is going to teach you how to be good and bad. And that's clear, isn't it? That means princely virtue can't quite resemble the old Christian virtue anymore, can it? Because if I'm going to teach you virtue in the old sense, I'm going to teach you how to be good, right? Machiavelli says, I'm not going to teach you that. I'm going to teach you how to be successful. How to get power and how to hold on to what you get. And if you want to do that, you can't be a nice guy. Yeah, Hannah.
I was going to say along with that, it's like, I can't remember if I said this in the Jan term class or not, but I believe to be a world leader, at least, I think about it in modern terms, but also you can probably, today, but you can also think about it in as far as princes during Machiavelli's time. I think you inherently have to be a bad person to be a good ruler, because you have to be okay with doing things for the people that you rule over that are going to affect other people negatively.
Well, and Musa actually says that. He says the reason Machiavelli's political teaching seems to be a little rough around the edges is because he was raised in a difficult time politically, because of all the chaos in Italian politics. Well, let me ask you, has there ever been a time in human history that the world and world politics didn't look like Italy in the 1500s? I mean, I must say, I think I'm laying my cards out on the table. Here's why scholars make that argument. How many of you are products of your time? Everyone is a product of it, right? And we're Americans, right? I mean, we believe in things like equality and television, and no, I'm serious, and blue jeans. Although I don't think anyone's wearing blue jeans, all right? But how many of you are only products of your time?
We're the products of our time and every other time that's gone before us.
But in other words, you're not just a blueprint of the cultural environment that you live in. Most of us are, let's be clear, isn't it true? And that is Musa's interpretation of Machiavelli. Machiavelli lived during the Italian Renaissance, and therefore his teaching is that of an Italian Renaissance thinker. There's some truth to that. But as you're going to see, Machiavelli himself says, I'm not just a product of my time. This is why I wanted to read today from the letter at the end of the book that he wrote, in which this is one of the most famous letters of all time. And did you read the letter at the end? What does he say he does? He goes out because he wrote this during his exile. And he was tortured. He was put in prison and tortured by the political vicissitudes of Florence. Same one, by the way, that caught Dante. How many of you have ever read the Divine Comedy? Dante also suffered from the vicissitudes of Florentine politics. So Machiavelli was exiled and fell out of favor. And by the way, that's why he writes that flattering introduction to Lorenzo. At the beginning he says, to the magnificent Lorenzo. Lorenzo was a two-bit shit. And so on one level, when Machiavelli writes to the magnificent Lorenzo, what is he clearly doing?
Kissing his butt.
He's kissing his butt, and he warns against it. Later on in The Prince, he says, don't pay attention to flatterers, at the very time that he's flattering his way back into favor. So in this letter, he says, I go out in the woods and have a nice work, and then I come home. I take off my dusty cloak, and then I open the authors of antiquity. So Machiavelli himself knows in other words, how do you escape from your time and circumstance?
Reading great things in the past.
Yeah, that's Machiavelli's method. And on one level, as a Christian, don't you believe that the Bible teaches you a kind of an eternal teaching that transcends culture and everything if it comes from God?
Yeah.
On one level, and I have to say, if I can get on my soapbox for a minute, that's why I ultimately think a liberal education, a college education is really about, yes, it's to help you count and type and get a good job. It's to transform the world and make the world socially just and blah, 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 blah. But the real core purpose of a college is to help you do what Machiavelli says he's doing in that letter. To introduce you to the great minds and thinkers of previous times and places, so that you can think your way out of your hole. Do you remember what Plato calls human life in Book 7 of the Republic? I know this was 2 years ago. The cave.
Yeah.
Do you remember the image of the cave? How many of you know the image of the cave from Machiavelli? From Plato. Plato says we're all born in a cave. And what is the cave? Are the social and political worlds we live in. And we're products of those, right? Can you escape your time and place?
According to Plato,
Yes.
yes, but it's hard.
Yes, it's hard. And who does that? The philosopher.
Yeah.
So this is Mansfield's way of interpreting Machiavelli. That Machiavelli was a human mind on the level of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Or Galileo, or who's the guy that invented calculus?
Newton? Well, there was another guy that also invented calculus at the same time.
Leibniz. Both Leibniz and Newton claimed and did develop calculus. Now I have to say, wouldn't you have some respect for somebody that can sit down and invent calculus? I mean, I almost lost my head trying to learn it. And I still don't get calculus. I still think something's funny is going on there. It's like that trick when you have a nut under 3 cups. I think that's what's going on in calculus. It's true, they have satellites and bridges that are designed on it, so it must work. But could you have invented calculus?
No.
Given the right circumstance.
In enough time. But have you ever heard the expression that 6 million monkeys typing for 6 million years could produce Shakespeare? That explains Dr. Donne. One monkey typing for 1 hour can produce Dr. Donne. So, anyway.
I would actually, if somebody told me that Dr. Donne's memoir was actually written by a monkey and not Dr. Donne, I believe them.
Well, you've seen the picture on the side of his office door, haven't you?
I've read the book.
Yes.
Oh, you've read the book?
He made it.
Desktop Warrior, is that what it is? Desk Warrior?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
talked a big talk about how hard it was to be in Vietnam and then wrote a book about how he didn't do anything in Vietnam.
No, he wrote that book when he was a prisoner in the primate section of the Brooklyn Zoo. All right, so anyway. So the new teaching is to teach princes to get and hold on by learning how to be both bad and good. And to go back to what Germino says about saving Christianity, he argues Machiavelli is a serious Christian. He wants Christianity to succeed in the world. But unless you teach and the only reason I thought of this, and thinking of Dunn, by the way, Dunn teaches international relations, but he doesn't, his real grounding is practical and comparative politics, rather than what's called international relations theory. And I have to say, one advantage of a small liberal arts school is you get a small department that teaches lots of interesting things. His Women in Asia course is a great course, but it's not a political science course. I mean, it is, but it's really a literature course, and he struggles with the words that are longer than 3 letters. But he doesn't really teach what you could call international relations theory. And here's a name you guys should know if you're interested in this. Two of the most prominent theorists of international relations are actually brothers, Reinhard and Richard Niebuhr, Niebuhr. They are called Christian Tragic International Relations Theories. And their argument is, in order to be a Christian in the world, you're either going to be a good Christian and be dead, or you're going to be a practical Christian. So Germino argues this is who Machiavelli is. He's a Christian realist who understands that to have successful politics, you're going to have to occasionally do terrible things inconsistent with Christian teaching. My favorite example of this, which I used in our, and I mentioned in our Foyle's War class, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a serious Christian, but in my favorite book on science, E = MC², David Bodanis describes this terrible episode where the Nazis were working on an atomic bomb. And the critical thing to building an atomic bomb was having sufficient amounts of what are called heavy water, of water with deuterium and tritium as the isotope, because that enables you to slow down the fission in order to create a controlled reaction. Because if you want to create a bomb, which is an uncontrolled reaction, what do you have to create first? A controlled reaction. The United States, as it turns out, which is one I know, it's time class is over. The United States had unlimited resources to build the atomic bomb, including massive amounts of industrial heavy water. But in Europe, there was only one place where heavy water was manufactured, in Norway. And British intelligence got wind of this, and they sent saboteurs to destroy the factory. And they did, but then they rebuilt, the Nazis rebuilt it. And they were making a massive shipment of 10,000 gallons of heavy water, which could have accelerated the Nazi bomb program, except it was being shipped across the deep lake by the factory on a civilian ferry with 1,000 innocent civilians on it. What was the choice? What was the decision that Churchill had to make?
Kill all the civilians to stop the Nazis from having a atomic bomb.
And that's what he did. Could you be a good Christian and send 1,000 innocent civilians to their death? So do you understand? So I don't agree with this interpretation of Machiavelli, but I can see how a reasonable person would say, he's a serious Christian, he was born and raised a Catholic, he never disputed Catholic teaching, and therefore the argument is what his teaching is really about is to enable Christians to live practically in the world. Yeah, Sierra.
Doesn't that also go back to like that, the train moral dilemma? Like how many people would have died if the bomb was made?
Well, and again, I use this in my presidency class, that those are people who want to be president. I always ask people who do, and there's always somebody that wants to be president, are you willing to kill innocent people? So yeah, let's put it, politics is a horrible business. Even under the best of circumstances, it's still a horrible business. So on one level, I understand that interpretation, but let's be clear about chapter 15. I think Machiavelli is actually teaching humanity how to escape from Christianity rather than how to preserve it. And moreover, let's be clear, you can all see this with princes, right? If you have political power, you gotta be a shit, right? But Machiavelli makes clear towards the end of chapter 15, and when I say this, I'm not only talking about princes, I'm talking about all human beings are in this situation. But princes, I'm talking about because they're more visible. But in other words, what's he saying? It turns out your situation, if you're a Converse student, and you're taking an exam, and you're bound by the honor pledge, what's Machiavelli's practical advice to you?
Bring through the honor pledge.
Cheat. But just don't get caught. So is your situation as a Congress student any different from any prince? What's your choice in this world? Be moral and be dead, or get an F, which is a student's version of getting dead, or cheat and succeed. One of my best friends in the Jewish community is a young man just moved from Israel, and he paid throughout his whole college career. He made it through college because he paid somebody else to take his exams. And I was astounded by this. You're a religious Jew. There are two commandments that cheating violates. What are the two commandments? Stealing and lying. When you cheat, aren't you stealing someone else's work and lying about it? So on one level, here's this religious Jew saying, I cheated my way through college. Well, he must have read The Prince. All right. We'll continue our journey to The Prince on Monday. For your information, if chapter 15 is the new politics, the new morality, it's based on a new view of humanity in chapter 18, which is based on a new view of the cosmos or world, minus God. And what's the new humanity? I'll stop talking.
I have class at 11,
Yeah, I know.
sorry.
Who's more important?